Hi there, I'm Auntie Sarah from CoffeeCraft, and today I'm bringing you a beginning sewing project. One hobby that I get a lot of fulfillment out of is sewing. You start with inspiration, you require a lot of perseverance, and then you're allowed to create something that is totally unique, and it inspires other people once they see what you've made with your own two hands as you're walking around wearing the thing. When I was thinking of a beginning sewing project, I wanted something that was not complicated, that did not need to fit anything very tightly, and that you could use so many different types of fabric and make the thing totally unique and interesting to you or whoever you're making it for. As you may know, the weather is changing. It's getting chillier and chillier in Michigan. And because of that, I'd say that Michigan has inspired me. I really like warm and cozy. So I was inspired by the cold weather to find some really soft, beautiful fabric and make a nice scarf that I could wear all winter long or give to somebody as a certain holiday is coming up. So I really just wanted to write down how Auntie Sarah would make a beginner scarf. If this kind of topic sounds fun to you, or if you just want some beginner tips for sewing, please follow along. So with that, make sure you grab yourself a hot cup of motivation. Then we're gonna roll up our sleeves and just get started. So to get started with this project, you're gonna want to get 1 yard of a 60-inch wide fabric. For this example, I'm using this really soft and fuzzy minky fabric. And, if you do the same as me, this is your fair warning that this is the glitter of fabric. When you cut this, it will be everywhere all of the time. So make sure you're wearing something that, you're okay with washing immediately. And you got your vacuum handy for all the work afterward. But to get started, this is a super simple pattern. Literally, we're just going to cut this yard in half. The plan is to cut literally the yard in half, so this will be 2 pieces that are 60 inches wide and half a yard long. Okay, so you can see I am marking this fabric with a permanent marker. You could use a erasable marker if you prefer, but this edge will not be shown because as we sew, this cut edge will be included on the inside of your piece, so it literally doesn't matter if it's shown or not. This is included in what's called the seam allowance. So you see now that I've marked it, that's half a yard wide. We're going to cut just along that blue line. If you've never used a rotary tool before, this is something I suggest using if you've got a lot of fabric to cut, or if you are using a fabric like I am today where it's, going to shed a lot. It's really good to have your fabric with the fuzzy or right side down and cut through your fabric from the wrong side. This allows the shedding to not be as bad as if you were using some scissors, and you're able to make the pass once, rather than cutting. It can be a little hard on your hands. You just push the trigger down, the blade should move forward a little bit and down, and then you just roll it like you're cutting a pizza. Make sure that you unclip it and it goes back into the safe position before you put it back in your drawer. So you can see all the shedding that this fabric is doing. That is the theme of today for me. It's just so much shedding, even in my coffee. But that's okay, it's extra fiber. All right, now this is an example. You can see that my beautiful soft fabric is nice and long. It's 60 inches by half a yard. And what we're going to do now is fold it in half long ways yet again. And this time we're going to pin the sides because this is where we're going to sew. We're going to sew the long edge together, and that's going to make a tube. So personally, when I'm sewing, I like to make my pins, every few inches, and I like to put them in perpendicular to the sewing direction. So we're going to sew along the edge of this fabric, and you can see that my pins are at a right angle to that edge. That'll make it really easy to pull out as we're sewing and ensure everything stays neat as we're sewing as well. If you choose to not pin, you are going to spend a lot of time, especially on this kind of fabric. The fur likes to slip on itself, or if you use something like a satin, it's really hard to keep your fabric in place and together while you're sewing. So that's the big reason why we use sewing pins. Okay, now you can see that I'm actually ready to sew. This is where I wanted to talk for a few minutes about what sewing machines are, what you need, and what you should be looking for when you get one. For example, I have a Husqvarna Designer Jade, and I chose this specifically because I am also interested in embroidery as well as sewing, and this is a machine that is pretty good at both of them. If you have another hobby, like let's say you're into quilting, or if you plan to sew on really heavy materials, I suggest that you look for a sewing machine that would be great for any future crafts that you want to use. But before you get to that point of buying a machine, I highly recommend you talk with your friends, your family, your community, and you find out if anybody else is already into sewing. Because having a mentor in this kind of a hobby is so helpful. All of the work that you do in sewing is pretty much problem solving, which means that you're going to need a lot of perseverance in order to get through each of these issues as you work on them, right? And one of those issues, unfortunately, is getting your sewing machine to work. So it's hugely beneficial to find someone who's willing to teach you how to sew, teach you how to use a sewing machine in general. And, having a little confidant as you go through your projects is always so nice, right? Having someone that you can talk to about what you're working on and, what issues you're having really helps make sure that you make the best work that you can. So the first thing you do when you get your sewing machine is you need to switch out the thread. I prefer to match the thread to my fabric. So in this case, I'm using a polyester material that is white. So my cotton black thread that I currently had in the machine for my last project does not match my fabric very well. Instead, I am matching it to my polyester white thread, and that is what I'm putting in my machine. This way, you're ensuring that the thread and the material are the same, and it'll make sure that if the material is, very, very strong, the thread is strong as well. And as you wash it, it's going to wear the same way as the fabric itself. It won't stand out. If you decide to either rent or buy a sewing machine, I highly recommend you take a long look at the instruction manual. Mostly, it has great diagrams about what is the correct way to thread your machine, what is the correct way to change your bobbin that goes in your machine, and it has a lot of instructions on what all the features are and how to problem solve certain issues that are common. These user manuals have saved my life so many times through different projects, but if you can't find this, like if you were to buy this machine secondhand and they didn't have the manual, take a look at the serial number on your machine and do some Googling. A lot of these user manuals are posted online, and a lot of them are downloadable for free. So this information is just so important that you get it right so that you can ensure that using the sewing machine will be a positive experience. Directions matter, tensions matter, and each machine is different. So following the instructions in my book probably won't help you much if you use a Brother or a Singer machine. You're going to want to follow the specific instructions for your specific machine. Okay, I'm just about ready, and I'm going to get started on sewing here. So the method that I like to use to set up a straight stitch, for example here, is we need to make sure it's all threaded correctly, and then we choose the straight line stitch. Now, there are many choices on types of stitches that different machines can do. In general, for now, I think you should mostly know about straight stitch and zigzag stitch. If you were to use a stretchy material instead of this, very stiff polyester, I suggest you switch to a zigzag instead of a straight stitch in this case. The zigzag will allow your fabric to stretch and move, and it will not tear your thread. Since I am not using a stretchy material, and this isn't a piece of clothing that's going to do a lot of stretching like a hat or a shirt or maybe a skirt would do, I am not worried too much about this. So I'm going to keep it very simple. Keep about a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch in my seam allowance. This is up to you. There is no hard and fast rules with this pattern. It's not complicated, but it's a great test of, your beginner skills of using a sewing machine, making sure that you've pinned things correctly, making sure that you're sewing in the correct direction, making sure that you've got right side to right side when you sew. These things are skills that require experience to just remember. So we're just going to do a straight stitch down the entire 60-inch long seam here. Another thing I wanted to mention was when we start and stop sewing. How do we do that? I generally like to do what's called a fix stitch, or if you don't have this method on your machine, you could always just manually sew forward, then manually sew backward. Just a couple stitches over and over, and that locks in the first stitch as a knot, basically. And that makes sure that when you pull on some strings or something, nothing comes undone unintentionally. You can always take a seam ripper and tear the seam apart if you need to, like if you were to sew wrong side to wrong side, for example. But if you don't, then using the fix method will really help. And a lot of machines have the cutting tool actually designed on the machine somewhere. In mine, it's up on the side of the machine. You can see that I've pulled the thread to the side and cut just on the machine. But other machines, it could be on a different location. So just take a look around and see if there's anything like that. Otherwise, it's handy to have a pair of scissors nearby just to cut your thread as you go. Okay, now that we're done, we're going to turn our pieces right side out. So you just reach your hand into the tube, pull the fabric up your arm until you can reach the end. Then you're going to grab that end with your hand and you're going to pull the fabric around itself so that the right side is out, or in my case, the fuzzy side is out. Now we're going to get into the only somewhat complicated part of this pattern. I think that the infinity scarf is such a fun design, but it is a little bit of a mobius. So to get started, we need to find where the seams align. And then we're just going to slide them left to right of each other and then pin. So what we want are the seams to not be right on each other. So we're going to fold our right side out fabric in half so that the open ends are together, line up the seams so that they are right next to each other, and then just slide them against each other until they're as far away as possible. And then we're going to pin right in the middle. Once we have that first pin, we're going to reach our hand carefully inside one side until you get to the middle of that scarf and pull it so that it is wrong side out. So that should have the scarf nested in itself. You should be able to pin across, and what we're going to do is sew with right sides together. So you should have the wrong side out and have the wrong side on the inside in this example. And we're just going to pin along the open end here. What we want to do is leave about a hand's width unsewn on the seam, and that's going to help us turn this to be right side out at the very end. You can do less than that if you want, but if this is your first project, I highly recommend you keep an entire hand's width. That way you can for sure, get the thing pulled right side out at the end of your project. But if you're highly experienced, you can do a lot less than that and, spend the time to turn it right side out. All right, now we are ready to sew, and I want to show you something that a lot of sewing machines have the capability of doing. I'm going to unclick my sewing bed off of my sewing machine. This allows me to have a much smaller sewing bed that actually will fit inside the scarf. This is so useful when you're trying to sew something that's a circle and it won't easily and nicely lay flat otherwise, and you don't want to sew the circle closed. So you can use this method for arm sleeves or neck holes. It's so helpful to know that you can do this with many different sewing machines. So first we're going to fix at one of our pin spots, and then we're just gonna sew right around in a circle. We're gonna keep about a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch seam allowance, just like the long seam, and we're gonna just sew right around until we hit the last pin, and then we're gonna fix it there too. Okay, so now we've done the majority of the sewing and I've taken the time to clip my extra threads. You don't absolutely have to do this since all of this will be sewn on the inside, but I generally think that keeping your threads clipped keeps your work neat. So it's a good practice to get into, even if this project is not super important. Now that everything is sewn, we are going to reach our hand inside the unsewn section, and we're just going to pull our scarf to be right side out. So to finish the project, we're going to match. Again, we're going to try to do right side to right side so that you don't have any of the edge showing in your fabric. And we're just going to sew that opening closed. So we don't want to sew around the whole thing, and we don't want to sew the scarf to itself on the other side, but we do want to sew that opening closed. So I'm pinning just at the opening, beginning and the end so that I know where it is, and then I'm only going to sew that part closed. So on this, you want to keep a seam allowance much smaller than the what you've been practicing with. Now, I'm using this really fuzzy, fluffy fabric, and one issue you can have with this is it can get pulled into your sewing machine pretty easily. So in my example, I'm showing kind of a wide seam allowance even for what I wanted here, but I really wanted to avoid having my sewing machine eat my project. If you're using like a cotton or, maybe a flannel would be really nice for this scarf, you should easily be able to maybe put on a zipper foot on your sewing machine and get really close to the edge for this seam. All right, so the last step we do is just trim your threads. You're going to want to trim really close so that they can't be grabbed by accident and pull out your seam there. I really love this project because it's a rather simple pattern to cut and a rather simple set of instructions to sew, but it comes out with a product that I think a lot of people could enjoy for this winter time. I've chosen this fabric that's super fuzzy and soft, but you could choose any fabric to make this unique to whoever you're making it for. And the nice thing is this is long enough to do a double twist to put over your head, but if you wanted only a single twist, you could do 30 inches wide instead of 60. You could get 4 scarves out of this. So it's really extremely customizable, and I look forward to seeing what you guys create as something similar. You've made it through my first beginning sewing tutorial. I really appreciate you watching this video and supporting me. If you really enjoyed this content, or if you want to learn more information, or maybe you're interested in checking out a written form of this tutorial, please head on over to coffeecrafters.org and see what we have to offer. We have many other tutorials as well. In the description, I've linked CoffeeCraft's Facebook and Instagram. So if this tutorial inspired you to make your own scarf, I would love to see it. And I'd love to learn who inspired you to make it as well if you're making it for a gift. And along that lines, I suggest that you start following our social media because we're doing a little mini series right now about different tips to make you actually enjoy crafting for this season. Sometimes this can just become a very hectic and overwhelming time. So we wanted to make sure that we give our perspective of how do we make sure that we stay inspired and stay, connected to our community as we try to tell them how much we appreciate them, right? Because that's what, but at the end of the day, we don't want to lose out on the experience or the actual joy of the season. And we hope that you keep that in mind as well as you go through your crafting journey. So thank you again for joining me today. I had a great time. So I look forward to seeing what we craft next time. All right. Bye-bye.